again, we want to thank you for coming and thank Dr. Nedley for coming. There are a couple of things I wanted to mention. There's been people asking about where are resources that you can access that can give you more information. This is kind of like drinking from a fire hose. It's a lot of information, and it's great information that we want you to be able to share with your friends and neighbors too. So there's some different websites if you want to write them down. One is called NEDLEY, N-E-D-L-E-Y, health.com. NEDLEYhealth.com. Another one is New Start, N-E-W-S-T-A-R-T, newstart.com. And then there's also a lot of Dr. Nedley's talks on YouTube. We're going to be working on putting them on YouTube for this weekend as well. That'll probably take place sometime this week. I want to thank Shane for his help with recording and running the sound system. And it's exciting to have resources that we can share with people, because I know all of us know people or are experiencing in our own lives different issues that we've talked about today. So thank you for coming, and let's have prayer before Dr. Nedley does his last presentation. Dear Heavenly Father, as we come before you, we recognize that we're in a great need of your love and of your help, your healing, not only of our bodies, but of our minds and of our spiritual well-being. We know that you love us, that you gave your life for us. Help us to be willing to share that love with others, to be willing to give of our lives, to lead people to the cross where they can experience forgiveness. Thank you that we can be here today. May your Holy Spirit be here with us. In Jesus' name, amen.
Well, today we're going to be talking about something that, looking at statistics in Montana, is an issue, and that has to do with habits that suppress the frontal lobe of the brain, including addictive habits. And addictions are rising not just in Montana, but throughout the United States today. There are more fun things to do than ever before in human history, but we have more addictions than ever before in human history, and we have more depression and anxiety and mental health issues. So there's quite an overlap, and it's very important to understand how we can enhance our frontal lobe, because in overcoming addictions, starting to get frontal lobe circulation and activity is vitally important, and so this is why this presentation is also entitled Enhancing Frontal Lobe Function. And of course, it's not just humans that can get addicted to things. Animals can get addicted. And of course, there's all sorts of studies in regards to animals getting addicted to cocaine and alcohol and things like that. And of course, animals have different predilections depending on their frontal lobe. Now, a cat has an amazing brain, but only 3.5% of a cat brain is in the frontal lobe. Now, let me explain a little bit about what the frontal lobe does. This is the area where we manage emotions, but it's also the spiritual part of the brain. It's where our willpower is at. And it is, also morality is centered there in the frontal lobe. And 3.5% of your brain being in the frontal lobe tells us that there's not a lot of morality in a cat. In fact, I grew up with dogs and not with cats, but I remember going over to my neighbor's house who had cats, a couple of garages down the street where I grew up, and I was just shocked to see this cat torturing a mouse to death. It had caught the mouse, and it was letting it run, and then it would take its claws into it, bite a little bite out of its back of it, and then set it down again and watch it run. And then do it again and continue to torture this poor mouse to death. And I was thinking, my dog would never be that cruel. Now, my dog wouldn't hesitate to murder other animals if he if he thought it was necessary, but the dog did it much more mercifully, did not like torture, and would put the creature out of its misery. And dogs do have more frontal lobe. About 7% of a dog brain is in the frontal lobe, and that gives them more ability to also plan. You know, when we were in Africa speaking there and then going through some of these vast African sections that have all sorts of wild animals and things, the people giving us the tour said, you know, the cat just has one plan. If it can't catch the animal in 90 seconds, it's done, and it's over with. But with dogs, they said they will actually plan. They'll plan to get the creature over this way, then another set will come in that way, and they'll be several steps ahead, and they don't give up after 90 seconds. They have that strategy there, and that's because of that higher frontal lobe to be able to strategize. And another frontal lobe function that we spoke about earlier, and it's very much in the frontal lobe, is empathy. I don't know if you've noticed, but most people's cats don't really care if you're home or not, you know, as long as they get food. But when you come home, your dog is glad to see you and is very much wanting to have a relationship with you, and that empathy, that's that frontal lobe aspect of things. Chimpanzees have the most of any other animal species. 17% of their brain is in the frontal lobe. But what sets us apart from the rest of the animal kingdom is our frontal lobe size. 33 up to 38% of the human brain is in the frontal lobe. And that's what gives us the ability to accomplish very advanced planning and thinking, gives us the ability to have very high levels of empathy for each other and even for animal creatures, and also gives us the ability to have willpower and self-control that the other animals cannot have. And this may have been a major part of what the book of Genesis talks about in creation, where it talks about the difference between the animals and humans, because humans were made in God's what? Image. And of course that's that advanced planning and thinking, all of that willpower aspect, empathy, all of those effects. So when the frontal lobe is compromised, which it will be by addictive behavior. So no matter what the addiction is, it's going to start to diminish the ability, the circulation and activity of the frontal lobe of the brain. And there's other ways of compromising the frontal lobe besides addictions. But we'll see the moral principle start to go down. We will see lack of foresight start to go down. Our reasoning from cause to effect is a frontal lobe phenomenon. And in fact, you can even follow your child's frontal lobe development. We talked about age 6 is when that frontal lobe really starts to kick in, but it continues to expand. By the way, do you know when the frontal lobe development is completed in human beings? What age? It's age 25 to 26 in females and age 30 in males. And so a little more development. Now at every age, you know, particularly 6, 7, 8, females might have a little bit of frontal lobe advantage over males. But if the male is actually in a very healthy state, etc., males actually do have more developed frontal lobes at age 30 than females have. And, but of course there's a lot of things that can impair that development if they get addicted, if they get those sorts of things. In fact, in regards to maturity level, we had a girl come through our program, all sorts of major issues. She ran away from home at age 14 and ended up on the street and ended up with a terrible lifestyle, and then got addicted to all sorts of things, including alcohol. And finally, someone told her about our program, and they believed in her enough to actually pay for her to come through our program. And she had wonderful success, but because of all those addictions that started at age 14 when she ran away from home, even though her brain was now ready to be able to grow and develop, her maturity level actually is at a 14-year-old level. And so, you know, she lost kind of 14 years of development as a result of that aspect of things. And so there's, you know, she's still growing and developing, But I had to even explain that to her in regards to, you need to realize you're more at a 14 level of emotional maturity level because of what took place. But the good news is our frontal lobe can actually start to catch up and grow later on. So lack of foresight, back to that. You can follow your child's frontal lobe development by how far they're planning for the future. And, when they're 4 or 5, you might tell them that something is going to happen. When it's Wednesday, that something's going to happen on Saturday, and they might be excited about it then, but Saturday comes about, if they're not reminded, they're not going to necessarily know about it or remember about it, because they don't have that ability to look that far ahead. But, eventually they'll know that when they're in the 2nd grade next year, they're going to go into the 3rd grade. The frontal lobe has developed that much. And hopefully their frontal lobe is developed where they make wise plans regarding their career and also their marriage partner and those sorts of things by the time they're reaching adulthood. Abstract reasoning is impaired when our frontal lobe is compromised. Our ability to interpret proverbs goes down. Now, calculation, division, subtraction, that is not the frontal lobe. If you're good at your multiplication tables, that's actually your parietal lobe. But higher forms of math, algebra, higher forms of algebra, calculus requires the frontal lobe. Loss of empathy will occur when the frontal lobe is compromised. And I don't know if you've heard this statement before. There's no way you can understand what she's going through unless you've walked in her shoes. Is that a true statement or a false statement? Actually, it depends on the individual whether it's true or false. If you do not have a good frontal lobe, you will have no idea what she's going through, even though you hear about it, unless you experience those identical things. But if you have a very good frontal lobe, studies show that you can just hear about what happened to her, and you can feel precisely the same emotions. And so that is how good our frontal lobe can actually be. And of course, when we have that type of empathy, we can be in a very good position to be able to help other people. Another reason why I'm walking in Beaver's shoes today. Lack of restraint. So when the frontal lobe goes down, boasting, hostility, these types of things, anger, loss of temper, even violence can occur. Reduced emotional control also occurs. And these are across the board effects of the frontal lobe suppression. Well, you might ask, what is an addiction? Addictions all have a characteristic effect of suppressing the activity of the frontal lobe. And the goal, of course, is to eliminate anything that will suppress the frontal lobe of the brain so it can achieve its full potential. We cannot achieve our full potential unless we overcome our addictions. And one of the things I'd like to encourage each one of you today is that it's not worth it. A lot of people think, for most people it's not good for them to do this, but for me, I need it. It's necessary so I can, quotes, manage my emotions. No, you don't need it, and you'll be able to manage your emotions far better without it. It will be a struggle, and it's well worth it, however, to go through that struggle, and we'll show you some of the reasons. Common characteristics of addictions: overwhelming compulsion to continually use, tendency for a need for increased amounts over time, dependency, meaning that if you do give it up for a few days, you don't feel good at all, and you start getting into these withdrawal symptoms. High tendency to relapse even after you've been off it several months, that stress can come into your life and you go back to self-medicating this way again and then think you're never going to be able to overcome. And there's a detrimental effect on you and others around you as a result of this addiction. Now, the American Addiction Association says you don't have to have all 5 of those, although they're often present. If you have 3 out of 5, that's an addiction. So if you want to get into the definitions of addiction, it's 3 out of 5 of those characteristics. So I'm going to illustrate an addiction that my father had. I talked about him earlier today. But my father was an engineer for General Motors, and designed automobiles, and loved his job and loved his design elements. He would often tell me, I can't believe I get paid to do these things. But he, in his 40s, started suffering from health problems. Engineering is primarily planning and sitting down and drawing things and doing cognitive work, but it's not really outdoor, outside work. And he started to put on significant amount of weight. And he was shorter than I was, but weighing more than I've ever weighed. And he started to have some health issues. Then two of his engineering friends, he was in his late 40s, two of his engineering friends died suddenly of heart attacks. And his parents had both died at an early age from heart attack and stroke in their late 50s, early 60s. And he thought, I could be next. What am I going to do differently? I'm overweight, not in good shape. And so he happened to come across a book. I wasn't, of course, a doctor at that time. I think I was like 13. And so I wasn't in a place to help him out. But he came across a book called Sugar Blues. And he recognized that he was addicted to sugar. This man loved chocolate-covered cherries. He loved Reese's peanut butter cups. He loved root beer floats. And so his life consisted a lot in regards to going to these sweet things. Well, after reading this book, he came home to my mother, and I remember because I was there, and he said, I've read this book, I'm done with sugar. No more sugar. Well, she smiled really big because she knew he was addicted and knew that wasn't going to happen. And so the next day he comes home, and she had even forgotten it by then. She treated it so lightly. She was cooking, or actually baking, in the oven, chocolate chip Toll House cookies. And you know that smell with the chocolate chip Toll House cookies when you come into the kitchen there. So he comes home, and those things are being baked. And he said, I can't take it. He said, I'm leaving. So he went outside to the garden, and he began to work outside because he was going to keep to his no sugar commitment. And so we had the chocolate chip Toll House cookies that night, and he had no chocolate chip Toll House cookies. So one day, no sugar. The next day, no sugar. It goes on now for 2 weeks. My mom's feeling a little bit sorry for him because she's still giving us sugary desserts. And you know, it was blueberry season now, and so it was blueberry pie that we were eating. And she felt bad enough for him that she made blueberry pie for him with no sugar. And so, then later on it was strawberry rhubarb season. And he says no sugar at all. He ate a strawberry rhubarb pie without any sugar. And something happened in 4 months. And in 4 months' time, the pies got switched. She told him that this was the pie without sugar. And he went into our pie, and he said, I can't eat it. He said, it is a sickening sweet. I can't believe I used to like this stuff. How do you guys eat this? And she says, there's something wrong with you. That is the pie without sugar. Something has gone wrong with your taste buds. So she goes into her pie with sugar, and her mouth puckers up, and she says, this is terrible. How do you eat this without that? Obviously, the pies had been switched. And then I noticed something that started to take place. So let's take a look here. I know this addiction had to start earlier in life, but I'm just going to guess that my grandparents, who I never got to know because they were actually dead before, his parents were dead by the time I was born. And they didn't know anything about health or the health message or those sorts of things. And so I'm just guessing that he had, like many of us had, this experience of getting addicted to sugar earlier in life. So I'm just going to see if you can guess what happens when a person, well, I'm already showing it. This is the dopamine curve the first time that you have Hershey's chocolate. And so that Hershey's chocolate, you've got this dopamine activity going. It's the sugar. There's also something in the cocoa that produces this dopamine stimulating effect. And the 3-year-old is thinking, wow, this is so good. This is amazingly good. Now, how long does that feeling last? A long time? No, just a few minutes at most. And then what does that dopamine curve do? Does it drop down gradually or does it drop down quickly? It goes down pretty quick. And when it goes down, it's there at the neutral level, but after that first time of that super stimulatory effect, it actually goes down a little bit less than neutral. Now, of course, the 3-year-old is saying, Grandma, that was so good. Do you have any more of that? And Grandma says, oh yes, there's more. You can have another piece. And so the other piece gets in the mouth. And what happens to the dopamine curve? It shoots back up there again, but now it's not quite as high as it was the first time. And when it comes down this time, it's actually a little bit lower. And then, what do you think happens after 1,000 times? Particularly if they're in fairly, rapid succession over the course of months. What happens then is your dopamine set point has been lowered. So even though there's nothing bad going on in your life, you just don't feel very good. And then when you have your chocolate, or maybe it's a chocolate-covered cherry now in a Reese's peanut butter cup, that dopamine level spikes up again, but notice it's only going up to neutral. This is why people in the stage of addiction think, I know this is bad for most people, but I need it. Because they think this is the only way I can feel normal and neutral, at least for a few minutes during the day. Now, contrast this with my father after 4 months. After 4 months, and we notice this effect, and it's going to take a different period of time depending on the addictions. But after 4 months, he would eat a corn on the cob out of the garden. And that corn on the cob would produce a dopamine level that doesn't spike up so much, but it gradually goes up, and it keeps going up, and he has another corn on the cob, and it goes up further, and it's still not coming down. And you would see this man enjoy natural foods at a level that was pretty incredible, because after those natural foods were consumed, his mood was still high for hours. So the meal is over with, and that dopamine level still stays up there and just gradually comes down. Now, there's other activities that would do that, we noticed in him, because he had no addictions. He would go on just a walk around the neighborhood. And going on that walk, and particularly if he'd be walking with someone like me or my mother, his mood was just very high. He enjoyed the conversations. We enjoyed our conversations with him. And after that hike was over with, the dopamine level would still stay up there and just gradually go down. So I saw a significant transformation in my father. Not only did he lose weight, did he get fit, was he healthy, but he was just a happy man to be around. Far happier than he was when he had those addictions going on. And so if you notice this curve here, both groups are getting their dopamine. However, the addicted group thinks they need to have this in order to get their dopamine, but they don't realize that if they give up their addiction, their dopamine level will be far above neutral the vast majority of the day, where now it's below neutral the vast majority of the day. And so the group that is non-addictive is the group that's living a far more happier, fulfilled life, and also making better decisions because their frontal lobe is in good shape, and what a difference it makes. But going to these addictive ways to try to increase our dopamine is a false way of altering the way you feel. And we need to recognize something. You can never get enough of what you don't need, because what you don't need will never satisfy you. Hershey's chocolate is not on the essential dietary list. It's not something you need. You don't need root beer floats. You don't need chocolate-covered cherries. Those are totally unnecessary for a healthy life. But you can never get enough of what you don't need, because what you don't need will never satisfy you. So let's talk about the addictions that can do it. Alcohol's a big one. Nicotine also is a big one. Marijuana, this whole falsehood that you can't get addicted to marijuana is not true. Marijuana is very addictive, and we have people in every program now. We didn't used to have them so often, but in every program that are trying to get over their marijuana and all the problems it's caused. And they can get into nausea and vomiting and significant withdrawal symptoms, although far less coming to our program. Opioids, which is a major problem in our society. All sorts of deaths of despair happening from this opioid addiction, close to 100,000 deaths per year. Benzos, highly addictive, and also frontal lobe suppression, and illicit drugs such as meth and cocaine as well. Then there are other non-substance addictions and substance. We talk about sugar and chocolate and caffeine. By the way, speaking of chocolate, what percent of the male population do you think is addicted? My father was one of those. Has an addictive relationship to chocolate that has those 3 out of those 5 characteristics. It's 10%. How about females? All right, one male said he's not going to comment, but I heard a female in the front saying 75%. It's actually 40% that have that addictive relationship, so almost 1 out of 2. And each of these addictions are going to have different gender associations with them as well. Caffeine, what percent of our society has a caffeine addiction? It's 80%, yeah, or a little bit over 80%. And caffeine is a drug. It actually is a frontal lobe suppressant. It blocks the adenosine receptors. There's a whole article by Dr. Bradford, one of the caffeine experts. He calls it the silent killer of emotional intelligence. If you have caffeine on board, you're more likely to gossip about your friend when you're with other friends than if you don't have caffeine on board, because you don't have that break on human behavior. And also, as far as critical thinking, it can adversely affect it. And it can also adversely affect your ability to manage your emotions. This was one of the secrets of the great quarterback, Tom Brady. Never utilized caffeine. And there was attempted murder going on all around him, but he still was able to stay calm and make a good decision with the ball. Where the quarterback's on caffeine, they would freak out, they would make bad decisions, and they wouldn't last long in the leagues. And so it can make a significant difference. Technology and smartphone, we talked about how that can be very addictive. Entertainment, television, or movies can be very addictive. PCP or video games, entertainment, internet, a lot of sections of the internet are addictive. And one of the most addictive, can you name the site? Yeah, social media is addictive as well, but even more addictive tends to be YouTube. And so, YouTube can be highly addictive. And you can get through the same dopamine curve on YouTube. You can watch something that someone tells you, that's very funny, and it produces that dopamine curve, and then you keep wanting to do another one. Hey, this one's associated with this. And the dopamine level is even going down less and less as you do more and more YouTube. And that set point is going down lower as well. And so we really should do YouTube for educational purposes, where it's a long thing that we want to learn about, but not just to alter our brain chemistry. Competitive sports can be addicted. Music with a syncopated rhythm is frontal lobe suppressing and addictive. Gambling, of course, And these are rising significantly. You can now do all sorts of gambling on the internet, but also pornography. This used to be, by the way, which gender do you think has more addictions to this? Yeah, it's the males. And it used to be by far, but not as much. Now the younger generation, it's showing 50% of the female population is now addicted. It has the same adverse effects as it is in males. And then there are sexual practices that are very addictive, what we call sex not by design, that can produce those dopamine curve spikes, but then bring it down below neutral very quickly. And so a lot of sexual practices are really altering the brain chemistry in a major way. Self-mutilation itself can be addictive. And people will often do it because they have bad emotional feelings, and so they want to get their mind off their emotional feelings, so they'll self-harm, and that self-harm will actually be so that they can distract themselves into physical pain, but then it actually brings out a cycle of addiction. And it also has its role of frontal lobe suppression. It has to actually be treated as an addiction. As mentioned, caffeine blocks the adenosine receptors. It actually reduces blood flow to the brain by 27%. Marijuana has been shown to impair numerous cognitive functions, from basic motor coordination to more complex executive function tasks, including the ability to plan, organize, solve problems, make decisions, remember, and control emotions and behavior. Cognitive deficits depend on marijuana quantity, recency, age of onset, and duration of use. And among short-term and long-term marijuana users, those who have chronic heavy cannabis use show the most enduring effects. In fact, it lowers their IQ permanently. Cannabis appears to exert impairing effects on executive functions even after 3 weeks or more of abstinence. And basic attentional and working memory abilities are largely restored after those 3 weeks, but enduring and noticeable deficits are found in decision-making, concept formation, and planning. And particularly in adolescence, it's even more dangerous. 8-point IQ decline if you're using it as a child or an adolescent. Quitting can prevent additional impairment, but at 8-point is a whole standard deviation, and it has a significant neurotoxic effect on the adolescent brain. It is also something that induces psychosis. In fact, yesterday there was an article published in a psychiatric journal showing the rates of schizophrenia are skyrocketing. Schizophrenia is a mental disorder that many feel is a fate worse than death, because you won't be productive, you're going to be dependent, you're going to have hallucinations where you're hearing things and seeing things that aren't there, and significant major problems. And they linked it to the increase in marijuana use. Marijuana-induced schizophrenia. Look it up. It's very significant. Marijuana-induced psychosis. By the way, we had although we're in California, and we're in Northern California, our county is a little different in Placer County, and that is no marijuana allowed to be grown recreationally, and also recreational marijuana is not sold anywhere in the county. And the only place even medical marijuana is sold is in a little town called Colfax, not far away from Weimar. And those people that were making a lot of money on medical marijuana decided that they wanted to go recreational marijuana, and they started paying our city council members and offering all sorts of things and in order to try to get this passed. And so they had a thing where you could go down to the city council. And one of the things that I mentioned, they allowed people, and I actually live in that zip code of Colfax. And so I'm one of the voters in Colfax, so I could go there. Of course, I told them about all the issues we have in regards to marijuana usage and getting people off of that sort of thing. But I mentioned that if you have a genetic tendency to schizophrenia and you use marijuana just one time, you increase your risk of going into psychosis and schizophrenia by 12-fold. That's what the studies show. So I said, if you want to give recreational marijuana I said, I don't think this should occur at all unless the person is given a $600 genetic test to see whether they have the predisposition for that. Because if you don't do that and they've got the gene for it, you have just dramatically worsened their life for a lifetime. So I asked the store owners if they would be willing to offer that $600 charge or test free of charge and wait for a period of time to see whether it comes back or not. Of course, they weren't interested in that at all. But I also mentioned it's kind of interesting that we're willing to give people things that have benefits and risks. And yeah, marijuana can make you feel calmer short term for a while, but at what expense when it does all of those things? And I said there is something that actually makes you feel calm and does not depress the frontal lobe of the brain. It's actually an oil that comes from the lavender plant called Selexon. Selexon's been shown to significantly improve anxiety, but your frontal lobe goes up because the anxiety is no longer there. For instance, they used it for people with test anxiety. You give them lorazepam, they feel better taking their test, but they do worse on their test. You give them Selexon, and their anxiety gets better, and their test scores actually go up. So I said, why aren't we offering things in this store that only have benefits as far as the brain is concerned? There's a lot of things we could choose from that only have benefits. And why is it that we're narrowly just focusing in on things that have benefits and serious, serious short-term and long-term risks? And of course, that's where humanity is at. These people get, there's so many things that are healthy for us that are not addictive. A lot more of those things than there are things that are addictive. And so why does humanity sit there and narrowly focus on the addictive things and try to walk that tightrope in regards to, I think I can do this and somehow get by with it, when there's other choices they could make to produce very positive effects without those risks. By the way, a very common form of psychosis before it gets to schizophrenia is what marijuana causes in the area of nihilism. Have you heard of nihilism? Alcohol will not cause you to be nihilistic. Sometimes people say, well, what's the difference? We allow alcohol, why shouldn't marijuana be legal? By the way, making one mistake doesn't make us guiltless when we make another mistake. I think alcohol should be far more controlled than what it is. But nonetheless, alcohol can suppress your frontal lobe, so you're more likely to be violent, you're more likely to get angry, you're more likely to do all of these things, you're more likely to commit a crime, but you're not more likely to go into a school and shoot up kids that you don't know. You're not more likely to go into a restaurant to do that. All of these school shootings and mass shootings, there's one ingredient they have found on board on every one of them. Guess what it is? Marijuana, because marijuana causes nihilism, and with nihilism you have this psychotic belief that everyone would be better off dead. And so you actually think you're doing them a favor, going in there and shooting them up and thinking they'd all be better off dead. And this is actually an effect of the marijuana itself. And so that's something that the news media has either suppressed or decided not to report on. We have all these arguments about using guns, not using guns. I think it'd be very simple. If anyone wants to utilize a gun, give a urine test, make sure no marijuana in there in the last week, and also make sure they make a commitment that they're not going to use marijuana. If they are going to, they ought to turn in all of their weapons and not have that possibility around. Alvin Toffler says when we're constantly stimulating our senses, there are things that will happen to the brain. Constant stimulation of the senses shuts down the analytical processes and ultimately shuts down the ability to do what? Face life rationally. This leads to escape techniques that involve withdrawal, apathy, and rejection of what kind of thinking? Disciplined thinking when you're faced with difficult duties and decisions. When do we need our most disciplined thinking? when we have difficult duties and decisions to make. But when we're constantly stimulating ourselves through frontal lobe suppressive mechanisms, we are going to reject disciplined thinking. And that means we're going to make bad decisions, we're not going to be able to face life rationally, and we're going to tend to withdraw. Apathy means you don't even care about things anymore. You know, a sign of apathy was when you get up in the morning and you're not excited about the day. It's natural to get up and be excited about the day. But when you're getting up just out of a sense of duty and responsibility, that is apathy. And that can happen to any of us once in a great while. But when it's happening the majority of the time, that is distinctly abnormal, and it's a sign that we need to improve our frontal lobe circulation. So a lot of people think, well, you know, maybe I can get over my addiction through hypnosis. And hypnosis actually has been shown about 4 or 5% of the time to be able to help with certain addictions. But the problem with it is because of how it works, and by the way, this comes from a hypnosis textbook that tells us how it works. Hypnosis attempts to cancel out frontal lobe functions and bring people into a trance in which they are what? Highly suggestible. So because of their being highly suggestible, that's why it's used, because then if the hypnotist can tell them not to use it when they're highly suggestible, it might work. But suppressing the frontal lobe to try to get anything good is not a long-term solution. And so what happens is these people will then pick up worse addictions down the road, and they'll be trading one addiction for another because of their frontal lobe suppression. By the way, hypnosis is most easily accomplished by training the eyes to focus in on one object, the best object being a little flickering light. And the hypnotized person will record information and duties without interpretation or without frontal lobe activity. Now, what trains the eyes to focus in on one object and flickers? What produces the flicker is the rapid scene of reference change in entertainment television. So if you want to know whether the television program is good for you or not, just watch how many frames of reference change in that first minute. If it stays the same reference, it's going to be educational TV. And that means you can actually learn some things from it, your frontal lobe can be enhanced by it, but when it has the rapid scene of reference change, and the average show today changes its scene of reference every 3 seconds. There'll even be a simple scene, someone coming up to the door. You'll see a camera switch as the doorbell is being rung. Then you see 2 seconds later the person behind the door coming to the door. Then you see another angle as the door is being opened. All of this camera switching on one scene keeps your eyes focused in on the set, but after 90 seconds to 3 minutes, your frontal lobe goes down because it can't take in all of those scenes, and so it gives up in regards to its analytical ability. And so that analysis starts to go down. Your memory works, your emotions work, but you can no longer put those in the appropriate subsets. And there's 17 different areas of suppression that go down as a result of watching entertainment television or entertainment movies. Study done in University of Wisconsin and University of Indiana a few years ago took 300 college students and randomized them to either regular movies or TV, which were bad enough, I wouldn't consider that a control group, or pornographic movies and magazines. And they found after just 6 weeks, 150 men, 150 women, after 6 weeks, less interested or less attracted to one's partner, more self-absorbed, less empathetic towards others, began to live in a very self-centered world and emotionally shut down in just 6 weeks. Willpower also went away. Dr. Zillman, one of the study's authors, says the negative effects of pornography on the brain have been more consistently proven than the links between what? Smoking and lung cancer. Now, those links are very tight with smoking and lung cancer. We all know that's true, but he says there's something that's even tighter, and that is the adverse effects of pornography on the brain. And, you know, I can't for the life of me figure out why this is so well proven, but yet we don't have warning signs, you know, and there's no efforts to try to remove these types of things except in rare cases. I know recently the country of Iceland banned it completely. So you cannot get it in Iceland. And if you do, it's against the law. And so some countries are starting to wake up. But in this country, aren't people waking up to it, but meanwhile we are seeing all of these emotional problems result. And this is something that is greatly used significantly, even in rural America, and I'm sure in Montana as well. So overcoming any addiction requires the understanding of temperance. I've heard some people say when it comes to addictions, let's just be moderate with them. We are to have moderation in healthy things. We can even get too much of a healthy thing. I've had people come in with medical problems due to drinking too much water. Now, I mean, they're drinking a couple of gallons a day, and they're not exercising and moving that off, and they're going to start washing out their electrolytes. That's not an addiction. People aren't addicted to drinking too much water. They have other issues of misunderstanding, etc. But we're talking about moderation in the use of what? Healthy substances. But it's actually best for have us to have complete abstinence from unhealthy substances. Now, some people will say, well, why is that? Can't we just reward ourselves periodically with unhealthy substances? Well, first, because it is unhealthy. Even rewarding ourselves periodically can be risky. But second is because of the addictive nature of these unhealthy substances and what it's doing to that dopamine pathway and where it's leading us around. So for the call for moderation, a person who has a compulsive relationship with something can no more use it moderately than an alcoholic can return to moderate drinking, or a nicotine addict can return to moderate smoking. In dealing with any addictive habit, total abstinence for life is necessary. It seems like that's cruel on the outset, but it isn't. This is the most merciful, compassionate approach. And that is because we have the ability to choose our own pleasures. If we reward ourselves with a bad habit periodically, we undermine our ability to develop enjoyment of a lifestyle that is free of that agent. And of course, I saw that in my father. He never went back to sugar. If he accidentally had it, he didn't like it, and he didn't try to develop a taste for it again. And his life was so positively affected by those change in dopamine curves. So some might say, well, once a month, well, that might be an improvement, but the desire is being kept alive and maybe even increased if we're not using it but once a month, giving a rise to a deep, distressing sense of deprivation in the meantime. But if the addiction is permanently abandoned and the thoughts directed toward the joy of being free, the addiction will soon not be missed. So to overcome an addiction, we need to have the knowledge that the habit is destructive, and we need to choose to overcome whatever that addiction is, and we need to be persistent at it. I talked about sugar, 4 months. Caffeine, anyone want to know the difference there? By the way, I can tell you another story about one of our counselors. One of our counselors didn't really know about the caffeine issue till she started working for us, and I started educating her. And she had bad gastroesophageal reflux disease. Caffeine weakens the lower esophageal sphincter, allows acid to go up into the esophagus, and she also had an irritability that bothered her in regards to her husband. She loved her husband, but she would lose it pretty easily sometimes in dialogue with him and then be very upset at herself for treating him that way. And then when she realized that caffeine was suppressing her frontal lobe of her brain, she decided, hey, it's hurting my GI tract, it may be hurting my brain, I'm going to give this up. Well, prior to her giving it up, the beverage that she liked, and everyone has a different caffeine beverage that she liked, but her beverage of choice was Pepsi. Every time she got thirsty, she thought of what? Pepsi. And she would drink a Pepsi. When she decided to give it up, now when she got thirsty, what do you think she thought of? She still thought of Pepsi. But she would say, no, not Pepsi, it's going to be water. Next time she got thirsty, what do you think she thought of? Pepsi again. No, not Pepsi, it's going to be water. That's what we call conscious competence. You have to stick with conscious competence You have to be persistent. Do not give up in that process, because your brain will start to change in some very positive ways. She noticed something, however, 1 month out. Actually, by 2 weeks, she had already noticed her reflux was gone and her irritability was gone. And so she noticed the positive effects. But a month out, she noticed now when she was getting thirsty, she wasn't thinking of Pepsi at all. What do you think she was thinking of? Water. And she was enjoying water. Before, she always hated water. Now she really even enjoyed the taste of water, and it seemed so refreshing to her. Well, about a year later, she was at a conference, and it was one of these conferences that had no water in the back, but only sodas to get hydration. And she had been there for several hours, and she was getting thirsty, and she couldn't see where she could get any water. And so she went back there and said, this actually looks good from what I remember. And she picked up a Pepsi and started hydrating herself with the Pepsi. She did not like it at all. She says, I can't believe this. This seems like someone dumped a lot of sugar and battery acid. I can't believe I used to like this stuff. And she put it away and never had another caffeine after that. So that persistence really helped her to become unconsciously competent. That's where it's no longer a struggle. It wasn't a struggle for her to continue to live that lifestyle. And a lot of people think, hey, once I give up an addiction, I'm going to have this struggle for life. No, you're not. Once that brain changes and you're persistent enough, it will be well worth it. Every addiction takes a certain length of time to overcome, but well worth the effort. The wise man says, wisdom is better than rubies. That means to have that full frontal lobe being active and working well with good dopamine activity. And all the things one may desire cannot be compared with wisdom. Whatever it is that you would love to have in your life or to have a desire for, it's actually not your top desire if you have things looked at objectively and truthfully. Your top desire should have a frontal lobe that is working well, where you can have that wisdom and that great judgment. There's an interesting biblical passage from the book of Mark where a wealthy man was coming to Jesus and asking what he needed to do in order to have eternal life. And Jesus actually told him, he says, I'm keeping the commandments. I think Christ was giving him a test. Commandment number 1 is thou shalt have what? No other gods before me. And he even called Christ a great teacher. He knew he had the Spirit of God in him, and he knew that he was a great individual, and he asked, what do I lack? And so to give him the test on number 1, he said, sell your goods, give to the poor, and come and follow me. Did the man do it? No. He went away, he had great possessions. I'm sure later on in his life he wished he had when he recognized where that ended up being. But then Peter and John and the others are really mystified about this. Who can be saved, And then they said, well, we have given up all, and we have come to follow you. Now, they weren't as wealthy as this man, I don't think, but they said, we have given up, and what are we going to get? And it's kind of interesting. It says, we've left all and follow you. So Jesus answered and says, assuredly, I say to you, there is no one who has left house or brothers or sisters or father or mother or wife or children or lands for my sake and the gospel's, who shall not receive what? 100-fold, does it say in heaven? Now in this time, houses, brothers, sisters, mothers, children, and lands with persecutions, because he says anyone who lives a godly life will suffer persecution. So even with the persecutions, you're going to have a far better life. And in the age, what will you have? Eternal life. We didn't really understand what he was saying until we got to that dopamine curve. Look at the difference. It's actually more than 100-fold difference in dopamine above the mean as a result of living a healthy lifestyle, abstinent from things that are going to hurt our brain, and using in moderation the things that will be healthy for our brain. And the advantages in this age are well worth the effort. And so I'd like to encourage you to, if you have any addiction, to make a commitment to overcome that addiction and go through what's necessary to do that. And also encourage others to get rid of the addictions in their life. What I have found in our depression and anxiety recovery program, we started the program in order to help eradicate people's depression and anxiety. But what we didn't realize was that we would be starting a program that at least the data shows it is the best addiction recovery program that you can enter into. We didn't enter it as an addiction recovery program. When we look at our data and the data of addiction recovery programs that are even 4-month programs, ours has a superior aspect to it. And I think it has a superior aspect because we're helping the brain chemistry to not need that self-medication. We're helping them to think true and accurate thoughts. And one of the most rewarding aspects of this program is people making a change in their life and giving up the addictions that they think are, that they have fooled themselves into thinking are necessary for them to even feel neutral at times. So I mentioned that I would open it up for questions. Of course, we could go into more details on some of these things. Maybe you'll have some questions, but I know we haven't had time for questions for the previous 3 presentations. So now's the time. I don't know if we have another roving microphone, but anything is game in regards to what we presented, or even some things that we haven't presented you have clarity of. While you're sending those microphones out, one thing I'd like to mention, several things actually. I got a letter yesterday from a hospital administrator that's over 6 hospitals in Northern California. And they're having an issue now with the change in the way insurances are. They're actually paying for lives. In other words, if they have so many thousand in their area, they get so much money per life, whether they get hospitalized or whether they don't. And when they get hospitalized, if those people bounce back needing hospitalization again, they have a dramatic reduction in their income because their expenses start to outdo the income. So now in many hospital systems, they're trying to keep people healthy. So what they wrote to me yesterday is we are teaming up with Weimar University to have 25 of your health graduates. These are the ones that get a certificate for health coaching. It's only a 4-month training course at Weimar. And we will pay for all of their tuition if they work for us to go into the home of everyone who's been discharged in the hospital. That's why they need 25 of them. And they will go into the homes and tell them how to cook, tell them how to live their lifestyle so they no longer need readmission to the hospital. And they're willing to pay a very good wage. I can tell you some of our kids in the academy learned about this yesterday. They're graduating, and you can't make a higher income after a 4-month training in anywhere than what you could learning to be a health coach. But they're not limiting it to just young people. They're willing for anyone between the ages of 18 and 80 to get trained to do this. And so, of course, they want to interview you and make sure you're committed to them. I suppose if you took their money for tuition and didn't work for them and decided to come up here in Montana to work, you'd have to pay them back plus interest if that happened. But it's exciting to see even hospital systems teaming up with Weimar to help people. And I know a lot of people that might make quite a bit of money get frustrated with their job because they're not really feeling like they're helping individuals. But just wanted to open that up to you, that our next health program is starting in August. And of course, we also have other programs. Many of our health graduates go on to become registered nurses at Weimar, or even doctors. We have a pre-med program, also a psychology program, and several graduate level programs to become a licensed counselor, and also to become a pastor. By the way, we have a big shortage of pastors in this country, and the next, I think it's 3 or 4 years, about half of the pastors are going to be retiring. And so we have a 2-year pastoral training course. If you have a bachelor's degree, we have a master's degree in mission and wellness. And this is where you utilize Christ's threefold ministry to revitalize churches and plant new churches. So the first year, you learn all the didactics. The second year, you go out in the field, and you will revitalize churches and plant new churches. Then you have your MA, and you can go right into the pastorate. And so this is a great program by Dr. Ratsara, Jay Gallimore, previous conference presidents, who said they had to retrain people to be pastors when they would come out of the seminary all the time and spend a lot of time. So I said, develop a program where you don't need to retrain them, where they're ready to hit the ground running. And so that's a possibility for people if you want to get into full-time ministry as well. But weimar.edu. So you mentioned a couple of other websites earlier. If you want to learn more about what's offered at Weimar, weimar.edu, and we would be glad to have you see what can be offered down there, and maybe even help the people up in Montana. All right, now we'll open it up for questions. Who was first? Or who has the microphone? Right here.
For several years, I've dealt with seasonal affective disorder, and just wondering maybe some of the whys, but mostly solutions.
Okay. So seasonal affective disorder tends to occur as wintertime depression. And it'll tend to really hit after the holidays and last often through April or so. And you can get really down. You can get depressed during those times. Why is it at those times? Anyone want to guess what's going on? Yeah, the sunlight is way down. You're not getting bright enough light, and you're also not getting infrared light because it's also cold to go outside. So one of the things, and I'm glad you asked that question, because there's a couple of things that I would like to mention. What do we get from the sun that's healthy for our brain? Vitamin D. Vitamin D occurs with ultraviolet light. And when you go outside and you look at your shadow has to be the same size or shorter than you are to get vitamin D. And it only penetrates a little bit of the skin. Vitamin D is fat soluble and it's fat stored. So if you get enough in the summertime here, it will last you through the winter, but most people don't get enough, and so vitamin D deficiency is a big thing. But when we discovered that vitamin D was so important for mental health, we began to randomize people to getting vitamin D through supplements, which did help, or getting vitamin D from getting enough direct ultraviolet light. And we found that the sun beat out vitamin D. Even if your vitamin D doesn't get as high as it does in supplements, there's something additional in the sun that is helpful for our brain. So we thought before maybe it's just the bright light. Light through the eyes helps us make more serotonin, and that is part of it, but there's something far more important than we neglect, that we often neglect, and it's called infrared light. At nighttime under darkness, if you're healthy, your brain will make melatonin. Melatonin is the most potent antioxidant known to mankind, and it can help us have rejuvenating sleep and to be a healthier individual, lowers the risk of cancer, all sorts of things. But what we didn't realize until recently is our cells can make melatonin inside of them, and they stay in the cells to protect our mitochondria from burning out. The mitochondria is the energy-producing aspect of the cell. Mitochondria is like an engine. If you want to have an engine last, you want to have it to stay cool. And the melatonin helps your engine in your cells to stay cool. There's only one thing that will turn on the melatonin-producing aspect of your cells, and it's infrared light, near-infrared light. And near infrared penetrates clothes. It can even penetrate your bone and go down a couple of centimeters in the brain. And by the way, the mitochondria producing cells in your brain, what part of the brain are they in? They're in the frontal lobe and other lobes too. They're in the gray matter. If you've heard of gray matter and white matter, where is the gray matter? It's all on the surface. And that's where the infrared can go into. And by the way, if you want to see if red penetrates bones, shine a light through someone's sinuses. You'll actually see it coming through, just the red colors coming through, because infrared penetrates. And so near infrared light is one of the secrets of not getting seasonal affective disorder, but it also helps with seizure disorders. It helps as an anti-inflammatory agent, and you can, as far as infrared light, you can get that from sun up to sunrise. So you don't need direct enough light. And so sunrise, you start getting that infrared, it starts penetrating, and like I say, it can even penetrate clothes. So what I would recommend for those prone to seasonal affective disorder, but it helps all of us, is even in the wintertime, dress up and get outside as much as possible. Outside, in fact, they're even looking at it. Your rates of mental illness are also directly related to how much time you spend indoors. And that's one of the factors with devices. If you've noticed, it's hard to use your computer screen outdoors in full sun. You can't even really see the computer screen that well. But there are very positive benefits of getting outdoor light beyond just the vitamin D. And even more important than vitamin D is the near-infrared light. Now, if you can't get out at all, they're making devices that produce near-infrared. They're LED lights that produce, it has to be between 850 nanometers and 1500 nanometers. But we've seen some dramatic results of just 15 minutes of exposure a couple of times a day of near-infrared and a lot of brain health aspects of things. And so that should help us to want to spend more time outdoors. You can get near-infrared even from the trees, from the reflection. You won't from buildings. If you're in New York City, there's light reflecting off those buildings, but it totally absorbs the infrared. You're not getting any of the infrared in the big cities. But you get it from being outdoors. Now, another advantage of being outdoors, the Japanese discovered when there's live plants around, is something called forest bathing. Forest bathing is very good for the brain. That's what they just showed. 2 hours walking in the forest is very beneficial for the brain. And it's not just because of the exercise, it's because of what the leaves are emitting. The leaves emit oils. They're now called essential oils. They go into our olfactory nerves, our smelling nerves, and they can make a very positive difference in mental health. Fortunately, at Weimar, one of the oils that's been shown to be very beneficial to breathe in is pine needle extract. And a lot of pine trees. I know there's got to be pine trees up here in the mountains as well. But there's all sorts of others as well that are beneficial. And so once again, if you have the opportunity of going to the gym or going outside in these mountains, go to the mountains, go to where the trees and the live things are, because you won't get the forest bathing working out in the gym. Now, it's still better to work out in the gym than not work out, but we really want to encourage people to spend time outdoors. The last time studies were looked at in outdoors was in 2019. Anyone want to guess what percent of time Americans spend indoors? 91% on average. And that even averages construction workers who are outdoors all day. So if it's 91% average and putting those in the average, you know where it is for most people. And that was pre-pandemic. Do you think that got worse or better? You know, the amazing thing is when the pandemic hit, California shut down the national parks. They shut down the city parks. They shut down all of the trails. I was going out there to go to a trail 2 days after the pandemic had the shutdown, and the trails had all these chains on them and signs, trails closed, COVID. Well, fortunately, I was the president of Weimar, and we have 15 miles of trails at Weimar, and we shut none of those trails down. In fact, we had everyone from the community coming to walk on Weimar trails. And it turns out walking outdoors on trails actually helped decrease your risk of COVID. It was actually the very opposite of what we should have been doing to help this pandemic, was to go outside. But most people were indoors, didn't even go out. I know people that didn't go out of their house. They even shopped on groceries on Amazon and had it delivered to their house and all of those things so that they would quit getting COVID. In fact, I had a patient that was doing that, and they still got COVID. Why? The person at Amazon that delivered it must have had it in their hands when they delivered it, and they still got COVID, being all that isolated, and they didn't do very well. And so the ones that were outdoors and were doing things to help, by the way, the comorbidity that was worse outcome for people with COVID, first, I think you've heard about obesity. The media hasn't told you about second. And by the way, this is on the CDC website. It was tied with obesity, almost at the obesity levels in suppressing our immune system and making you have a bad outcome if you had COVID. Anyone know what it was? Anxiety. Anxiety. Anxiety suppresses our viral immunity significantly. And so the more you were indoors watching the media of what was going on in COVID, the more susceptible you were becoming to dying of COVID when you got it. And so we want to be able, and of course being outdoors helps our anxiety. It helps all sorts of things. But I know that's a long answer to the first question, but it helped me to say some things that I thought would be helpful for this group to hear. All right, over here.
First of all, I was glad you clarified leaves on trees doing something, because we don't have many deciduous trees here. So when you said pine needles, I'm like, all right, cool. So that was good. I mentioned to you a little bit at lunch, and I was talking with someone last night. My father's been coming down with Alzheimer's, dementia, whichever, and we've found that I had an aunt that repeated herself 5 years ago, was repeating herself, and then we called her and she remembered everything. And we found out what drugs she was on. And so I wanted to find out, and this kind of ties to last night, brain activity and drugs. And I researched last night the drugs he was on, or put on, and it's memantine, M-E-M-A-N-T-I-N-E.
Yes.
And the other one was donepezil, D-O-N-E-P-E-Z-I-L.
Yes.
So what do those do to the brain, and am I going to have to worry that 6 months from now he's going to get used to it and he's going to forget everything again?
Yes, you do have to worry about that. But what those drugs are doing, the second one is also known as Aricept, and that is actually helping acetylcholine. So we talked about choline a little bit last night. I think I just had it listed there on a slide. Choline is needed to make acetylcholine, and acetylcholine is used a lot in regards to memory. And so that tells us that there was an acetylcholine issue, the fact that he got better. And the other drug is known as Namenda. And Namenda is helping some of the memory receptor aspect of things. So both of those drugs can be utilized. However, there is something that was tried against Aricept, and it was found to be better than the leading drug with less side effects, and it works differently, so you could use them together. And it was actually a spice, and we use this spice for people particularly that are under methylators in the depression and anxiety recovery program, and I think I heard someone say it, saffron. So saffron, 30 milligrams of saffron twice daily was better for memory than the leading drug. And so, and it also helps some of the depression, anxiety aspect of things. There's also another anti-inflammatory that's been shown to be very helpful for Alzheimer's called turmeric, just about 1,000 milligrams of turmeric a day. And then omega-3, the long-chain omega-3s that we get from the plants of the waters are healthy for them. And also NAC, N-acetylcysteine, it's an antioxidant that can prevent further degeneration in those plaques. We also, for someone with Alzheimer's, want to make sure their blood pressure is controlled. The higher your blood pressure, the faster your brain shrinks, and the more cognitive issues you will have as you age. And so we want to see that blood pressure less than 115/80, and we want to see the cholesterol at 100 plus your age or less. The higher your cholesterol, the more likely you're going to run into dementia as well. And those two things are very critical, but it can make a significant difference. And I'm glad those drugs have helped the memory, but if we don't take care of the underlying defects, that memory issue is going to, in about 6 months or a year, be as bad as it was before. So, yeah, great question. Anyone else? Yes, in the back.
So going back to the sugar addiction, where would you place honey?
Honey is sugar. Yeah, it is about 3 percentage points healthier than sugar, because it does have some minerals and other things, but it still has those adverse effects. And so my father, I should have made it clear, he was not only sugar-free, he was completely honey-free. He wouldn't put any honey in there. Now, another problem of utilizing honey is that it's going to keep your sweet tooth intact. The addiction is still going to be there. And because he didn't use any artificial sweeteners, he was able to develop a relish for natural foods that was just hard to imagine. My uncle used to come up from Texas and say, it's worth coming up here just to see this man eat natural foods. He just enjoys all of those things, and he's got a big smile on his face, and he couldn't help but comment, wow, this is like dessert, as he's eating an apple off the apple tree. This is just amazing. This is better than any of the sugar things I had. And he just had that great attitude about things in regards to even in the midst of eating. And he wouldn't have got that if he was using sugar substitutes. It wouldn't have tasted near as good. Maple syrup, same thing, sugar, yeah. Dates might be kind of on the edge there. Dates, eaten whole and eaten in that way. But date sugar is something we would avoid, where we refine the dates and just make date sugar. But dates could be possible. Yes, any other questions? Another one in the back.
Okay, so you mentioned in the city you're not getting the infrared light even from the reflection of the buildings. And I was wondering about window. What about the light you get from windows? Is there very much benefit to that kind of light? What benefits are you missing out on?
Yeah, so great question. Windows can let infrared light in if they're the right windows. A lot of these newfangled buildings where you see these black windows everywhere, they're not letting infrared light in. And even the new hospital systems, they're having all these dark windows, and they're actually taking out the ultraviolet and the infrared. By the way, speaking of COVID, and this was shown earlier with other viral infections when the flu went through our country with the flu pandemic, there's a significant difference of whether you survived COVID when you were put in the hospital as to whether you were put next to the window. And in Brazil, they don't have private rooms in their hospital system. And what they found is if you were lucky enough to get to the bed next to the window, you were far more likely to survive. Because if you had 2 COVID patients, they put them in the same room because they can't necessarily infect each other. And the one away from the window had far poorer outcomes because they didn't have any infrared light coming in. So when this data was coming out, and we also knew that data, the old hospital systems, I actually work in an old hospital, it's the Auburn Hospital, and those old hospitals, they were kind of made up of squares, and in the middle was outside. So you would have sun, you would have nature, you could actually go outside to, trees and grass on the inside of the hospital. And on the outside, you had all this vegetation and grass and sun so that everyone could get sun in their room, because even before the pandemic, we knew there was something about sunlight and helping people to overcome infections. But modern technology kind of forgot about all of that. And so now people are put in places where they can't get any sun. So one of our doctors at Weimar works as an ICU critical care doctor in Sacramento Sutter system. And he was very intentional when he had his COVID patients. The ICU's on the 2nd floor, and there was a balcony out there. and he would order the nurse to take the patient outside and get that sun. And it turned out to be very popular because none of the families were allowed to come in and see their sick ICU relative, but they would actually know where that was, and through phone, hey, I'm about ready to go outside, and they would stand 100 feet away and actually talk to their relative who was sick. And at first, the hospital nurses were really upset. We already have too much work to do, and so Dr. Mitchell himself would actually take them and wheel them outside to get that infrared light. And once they realized he was doing it, then they did that, and that hospital ICU had the best outcome as far as recovering from COVID. And so we want to get windows that aren't going to filter it out. How do you know if it is filtering it out? One of the ways you know is if you are sitting in a cold room by the window and it starts getting warm as a result of that sun. Infrared also produces heat, so that means the infrared is coming through that window. In these modern hospital systems, it can be cold inside and you're not going to feel any warmer getting next to that dark window that filters it out. So that's one of the ways in which you can tell the difference. All right, yes.
Several websites were mentioned, but a good one I found was Audioverse. However, it took me quite a bit of time to find you on it. Why did they put you under the name Alan Lloyd?
Okay. No, that's a good question. I am on Audioverse, but I don't have my real name on Audioverse. Audioverse is normally presentations that are given specific to religious and spiritual audiences. And so Duke University was going to invite me there, so of course they Googled my name. They got on a presentation that talked about the BMI of the 144,000, and they heard Revelation being quoted, and they disinvited me to Duke. And of course the health message is to be the entering wedge. And we have to know our audiences. And so I told Audioverse, get rid of me on there unless you put a surname. So my middle name is Alan, and my father's middle name was Lloyd. And so that's how it ended up becoming Alan Lloyd. So yeah, we've gotten some mail where that sounds like Dr. Neil Nedley and not Alan Lloyd. Well, it is Dr. Neil Nedley, but now you know the secret. All right, anyone else? Yes, go ahead.
Well, I imagine then the infrared saunas that you can get these days are probably doing the same thing as far as getting the infrared, or am we wrong about that?
Yeah, so the infrared saunas are specifically designed for the heat. And hotter than near infrared is far infrared. And so most of the infrared saunas, it's a lot cheaper to just do far infrared. So those are much more than 1,500 nanometer wavelengths. They can heat you up, but they're not going to help your melatonin intracellular production. There are a few saunas that are full spectrum infrared, and those will be good. So you'll get the heat and you'll get the near infrared. So you have to look at your sauna to know whether it's giving you near infrared. And then of course you can buy these LED lights that are just near infrared. Even those have a little bit of heat, but they're not going to heat you up like the far infrared will. So it interacts and actually penetrates our cells, and that near infrared light, I would have to give you a whole light, electrical, biochemical lecture, but that near infrared turns on intracellular melatonin, and that melatonin hangs around our mitochondria to keep the energy there and for us not to get burned out. And so it really helps energy levels. It's also been shown to be anti-inflammatory. And as I mentioned, melatonin is the most potent antioxidant known to mankind. There's nothing better than getting melatonin in those cells to have those cells survive and do well. And that's why it did so well under COVID. Under COVID, a lot of it had to do with your antioxidant reserve as to whether you were going to survive or not. And so that infrared developed that reserve of that antioxidant reserve inside the cells. And so what this means is that we knew the sun was healthy, but we had no idea how healthy it was. And it may be just as important as the nutrition lecture I gave last night. We have a lot more evidence in regards to nutrition, but now we're getting a lot more evidence in regards to the advantages of being outside in the sunlight. We had a gentleman speak at Weimar University 3 weeks ago. He's 100 years old. He came in his red sports car, drove himself there. He got out of his red sports car and he almost ran uphill. He was chasing me, Neil, Neil, and I look around and there's my former professor at Loma Linda, Dr. John Scharfenberg. And he gave the sermon that day. It was a great sermon. And then in the afternoon, he gave a nutrition lecture on how to live to 100. And he gave us some great nutritional pearls on how to do that and the antioxidants and all those things that can help you live that long. But then he also mentioned the sun. He said, my brother was on a very similar diet than I am, and he lived into his late 80s. But he said, there's two things that I had an advantage of him. One that I haven't talked about, intermittent fasting, where you don't eat in the evening and you get ketosis. That's also very healthy for your cells, helps them to last longer. So he said, I've been very particular about not eating suppers. And the other thing is, I spent, after I semi-retired in my 50s, I spent the majority of my days outside. I was doing garden work, I was doing all sorts of things like that. And he was 100 years old, still straight, and still with a great mind, was able to remember what people were saying. Even from that morning, he was reminding me of things and then added on to the things I was saying. So he had a very clear mind. And after the presentation, there was question and answers, and one of them asked, do you have any diseases? 100 years old and still going strong. And he said, yeah, I've got a couple of health challenges. He says, my hearing is not as good as it used to be. But he had no hearing aids in. But he did have to, go like this and to hear. And he said, the other thing is my doctor did a DEXA scan on me and tells me I have osteoporosis after 100 years. He says, I asked the doctor how bad it was, and am I going to have a fracture this next year? And he said, according to your DEXA scan, you have a 5% chance of developing a fracture this next year. So he says, I think 19 out of 20 is a pretty good chance. And so he's going on further. But the outdoors, he attributed his outdoor time to his longevity. All right, we'll take one more question, and then I know we need to be able to get some of that outside health experience. Yes?
I have that seasonal, effective, whatever, and I got a happy lamp, but I don't notice a great deal of difference. What you mentioned about medical?
Yeah, medical grade a blue light. The happy lamp, if it's, I don't know what type of happy lamp you is it white?
It's light.
Most happy lamps are white. Yeah,
it's kind of
yeah,
white.
they're white lights. With happy lamps, you have to have about 10,000 lux for 30 minutes. It has to be pretty bright to get the minimum effect. But a medical grade blue light, it's actually the wavelength of the blue sky that's healthiest for us in the morning. The medical grade blue light is far less bright. It only needs to be about 400 lux, and you won't need as long of an exposure for it to be beneficial. So in our program, we're using the medical grade blue light for the seasonal affective disorder, and that pretty much helps to eliminate it. And you could learn more about that on the NEDLEY Health site if you're interested. Well, you've been a very attentive audience. I certainly want to wish you the best of health of body, mind, and soul, and I hope you're able to incorporate this information in your life and also tactfully share this with others to improve the health of body and mind in this beautiful valley here in Montana. Thank you very much.